Hello friends, Pastor Michael here, and I pray you're enjoying our Acts series as we kind of walk through the book of Acts and see, man, the Holy Spirit's work through His people, and it continues through us today. And I'm really looking forward to my conversation with Tanya Hilton, so you want to stick around for that. But before we get here, here's our weekly connection. The Gala is in 2 days, and it's kind of the last call for registration and tickets. We've been talking about this for several weeks now, and so it's so exciting that this incredible night is about to come to fruition. Side note, bidding has already begun on select items, so make sure you click the link in the description to get caught up to speed and make your own bids. And so we'll see you there. Also, every few months, we start new community groups that focus on specific areas of life that you might be struggling with. We call these our CG Cares offerings. For example, like divorce care. So if you're walking through divorce, that would be a wonderful group for you. Or grief share if you've lost a loved one, a wonderful group for you. Or cancer companions. If you or a loved one is going through cancer, that is a group for you. And there's a smattering of other offerings, so please check that out. And those start this month. They begin now. And so I highly encourage you to check out CG Cares page to register using the link below. Also, in May is our IF gathering for 2024. It's happening at Christ Greenfield, the Gilbert campus on May 4th. This is our yearly women's event that we love and is so dear to our heart. And this year, for the IF gathering in 2024, we want to create a sacred space, a place where you can experience Jesus. As we lift our voices and hearts to Him, we're reminded that Jesus is the reason for our hope and our joy. If you're one of the amazing women of Christ Greenfield, join us as we magnify His name together on Saturday, May 4th from 10:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. at the Gilbert campus. You can sign up by visiting christgreenfield.church/woman. With that, we'll be right back with our CG Live conversation. Well, hello friends. Welcome to CG Live. Back with a special guest and friend, Tanya. Do you want to maybe just reintroduce yourself?
Sure.
I think it wasn't too long ago we were on this together.
Yeah, conversation about counseling a couple weeks ago, maybe months. The season blends together.
So it goes by so fast. Yeah. Why don't you introduce yourself again and then we'll get going.
I'm Tanya Hilton. I'm with the spiritual care team. I'm also a biblical counselor, and I am a leader with Unite Leadership Collective.
Yes, and I'm so excited to have her today because it's somewhat heavy of a topic, but very, very pertinent because we all go through seasons like this, and it's on the topic of suffering, on topic of suffering. And so I thought maybe we should start with the what, like what is suffering?
Yeah. Well, I think suffering is defined differently by different people, but I think you can put it into two different categories. We have the earthly suffering, the physical, the mental, the emotional, right?
Yep.
And then we have the spiritual suffering, which happens when we don't have Christ in our ear. When we hear God's wrath, even that's a heavy suffering. And so we can have both at the same time. We can have the physical, the earthly suffering, and not feel that God is for us. And that'll give us the spiritual suffering. And then there's some people that you see that they have all of this suffering and you're like, how can they be happy? How can they have joy? Well, they have all this physical suffering, but they have Christ in their ear and they know that Christ is for them. So they're not experiencing the spiritual suffering.
Yeah, and I feel like that really describes because we're in the series on the book of Acts, and you'll see this especially with the disciples. That's really the difference. They went through a lot of suffering, yet they had this joy that surpassed understanding. It wasn't connected to their situation and circumstances, but to Christ.
Yeah.
And so what the suffering is real. It is real.
Oh, yeah.
And so, I guess the next question is, why suffering? This is one of the quintessential questions almost everybody, believer or not, asks, why suffering?
Yeah, that is a hard, heavy question. Why is my loved one dying? Why did my child get taken away from me? Why are these terrible things happening? And the easy answer, and it's not something a lot of people like to hear, but the root of it is original sin. It's because we were separated from God's grace in the garden. We rebelled. We wanted to take things into our own hands. And that is the root of suffering.
Yeah, because that sin brought separation not only from us to God, but like creation itself started to like
attack us
and unravel. And so, that is like the foundational question. But as you mentioned, it's really not super satisfying because it's very overarching. And a lot of people ask it personally, like, why am I suffering? And the correct, well, I don't know if correct is the right word. The true answer that is really not satisfying for people is, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't
Right.
know.
Right. This is the part of God that we can't explain with our senses, and we can't give a reason why. Why does the person who's completely healthy, they've run miles every single day, never did any drugs or smoked or anything, why do they get cancer?
Yeah. And then you have, some people who they're 90 whatever, smoke 3 packs a day. They're still doing
going.
we don't really we don't know. And it's really unsatisfying, but I found even with that, it's can still be helpful. Because I think sometimes we think we want answers that somehow that's going to satisfy or explain it. And then we understand, and it really it doesn't. And so I think often God just invites us to sit in the hiddenness, in the mystery of maybe not really knowing. An example of this is Job. Job, man, talk about quite a book to read, but you get towards the end, and finally at the end, God goes, "Hey, Job, put on your big boy pants. Let's have a talk." Right. And so he gets to talk to God. But what's so interesting is God never explains why he went through what he went through. Essentially, in the last couple chapters of Job, he just kind of says, "Hey, I'm God.
Let me handle it.
And you're not.
Yeah.
Let me handle it. Just trust me, buddy. I got you."
It's hard.
It is really hard. An example I've heard of this is if you've ever raised kids, a lot of times they'll ask why, and you're like, "Hey, just you do your best to explain, but at some point you're just gonna be like, you gotta trust me." For example, why do we have to go to the dentist? Right? And you try to explain about teeth healthcare, and you get there, and to the child, it's this is awful.
Yeah.
This is suffering. Why am I? Right. Why are you doing this? To me, and it's well, this is actually gonna be good for you. Now, that's not all analogies kind of fall short. It's not super helpful, but I think a lot of times in the midst of suffering, God doesn't tell us why, but invites us to trust.
And that's hard.
Yeah.
That's a hard thing, because I feel like sometimes people, when they're going through misfortunes and suffering and physical and emotional hurts, they're thinking, what did I do wrong? Right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. What did I do? Not just what did I do to deserve this, but I must have done something to deserve this. It's almost
some sort of punishment or penalty.
Penance. Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah, that's hard.
That is really hard. And I think it's because we live in a world that's so transactional. Mm-hmm. And so we apply that then to God.
Right.
God he operates. Yeah, he must operate on the same way. And that's also not true.
That's not true.
And so I guess this kind of leads to the next question. So why suffering? We don't really know. Foundationally, it's because sin has entered the world. So if we don't know why, well then what can we do? What do we do when, let's start with us. What do we do when we go through suffering? And then next, what do we do if somebody we love is going through suffering?
Well, one of the things that I think most people do when they do experience suffering, when it's just too much to handle, they retreat. They turn in on themselves. I mean, it's like a wounded dog that just wants to hide and be alone. And that's one of the worst things that you could possibly do. God calls us to be in community with others who are suffering. Whether we're suffering or not, he calls us to bear one another's burdens. Mm-hmm. So the one thing that I would recommend anybody, regardless of where you are in this line of suffering, spiritual, emotional, physical, get in community. Find somebody who understands what you're going through. Or just speak to a pastor, speak to a friend. It doesn't have to be a professional. Speak to somebody. You want to be in community.
Yeah, it really is like counterintuitive where we do want to just turn inward and isolate. We think like, well, I'll just figure this out on my own. And it's very vulnerable to put your suffering out for others to like know about or see. But it's in sharing each other's burdens that there's actually healing. And Tanya hit on something huge. There is something about walking through suffering that other people know, right? Like if you've ever lost a loved one and you sit down with somebody else who maybe lost a spouse or a grandparent, they know.
They know what you're going through. Yeah.
And you feel seen and heard because like, man, they know the pain. Yeah. They know the suffering. So,
you know, and the thing is that when you're in the middle of it, when you're in the middle of that mess, people tend to think that no one else is going through this or no one understands what they're going through.
Right.
That's not true. You would be very hard pressed to find somebody who's not experienced something you've gone through, feelings, emotions, the whole range of it, you know, because the beginning of suffering can be very destitute, very isolating. And then when you are in chronic suffering, you can even lean towards the other side where you start experiencing anger towards God and anger towards your environment. And there's people who know how you feel.
Yeah.
You're not alone in that. And you don't have to be alone.
Right. I have found all the times I've like put my difficulties out there, whether to a group or even in a message, the number of people that like come talk to me, you know, like my mom's kind of on her cancer journey. She's made it through chemo and radiation and is doing, for the most part, really, really well. But I remember the first time I shared that, all the people that came up to me and were like, my loved one, I know, like, you know, what you're going through. And two, that's why, like, you know, for us at Christ Greenfield, that's why small groups is like such a huge thing, or even our CG Cares groups. That's why we have like Grief Share, Divorce Care, Cancer Companions. I mean, talk about just areas of suffering so many people go through, and you almost like we need each other to get through it together. Yeah. So if you are going through any sort of suffering, and maybe you just needed like next step, I mean, reach out to me and like, I'll get you plugged in and connected where you need to go, whether we have the group or not, or spiritual care team. We have people who like want to pray for you, talk to you, visit you. And so like, you know, one of the things you got to do in suffering is to know like you are not alone, right? Especially like, that's why God gave us the church, gave us each other. Right. The other thing you can do in the midst of suffering, you kind of mentioned at the end, is like people get angry at God. And I think a lot of times we think, well, I can't be angry at God. And the answer is you can be. It's just, what do you do with that anger? Where are you going to direct that anger? Is the anger going to go inward, like you continue to turn in on yourself? Or do you actually turn your emotions, your questions, your frustration, your anger back towards God? Right. And the way you do that is through lamenting.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So like Tanya, a third of the book of Psalms, which is the hymn book of God's people, is laments. Them crying out to God, being, God, like, where are you?
Why is this happening?
Why is this happening? What is going on? And so, in fact, there's a whole Old Testament book called Lamentations. So Scripture provides a faithful way to articulate all of your emotions and questions and frustration and anger towards God. And what's beautiful is like, he can take it.
Yeah. I always say God's got big shoulders. He can take it. And, you know, God would much rather you be angry at him and stay in a relationship with him and pray to him and ask questions and lament than to say, you know what, God's not for me. He's not there for me. And then turn your back. And then you're alone, even though God is still with you, walking right beside you, pursuing you, chasing you down. But then you feel so alone. Yeah. It's such a hard place to be in.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I mean, how beautiful that he actually invites us to do that, right? He's not scared.
Right.
He's not scared of your emotions or your anger. So you can do that. But also what's really interesting when you look at laments in the book of Psalms and in the book of Lamentations is always somewhere in them, in the middle or towards the end, is they cling to what they know. what they know to be true about God.
God's promises. Yeah.
They cling to his promises. In the midst of their suffering and their crying out and even their anger, they cling to like the promises of God. So I guess, Tanya, for you, what are like in the midst of suffering promises that you would cling to?
You know, one of my favorite verses, and I had this as I was developing my relationship with Christ, and it was something I would always turn to when things were not going well. And it's Romans 5, you know, that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, you know, and that was one that it was always spoke to me. So I recommend that people just go through and find a scripture verse that speaks to them that is about the promise. You know, that Christ is for you. Christ is with you. He will chase you down.
Yeah.
You're united with him in his death and his resurrection. And so all these promises, that's all we have to cling to. Yeah. Because everything else is not guaranteed.
Everything else is fleeting and momentary, can be snatched away so quick. And, you know, I love how you said, even in between, you would speak this to yourself. Because really that's what it is, like, speaking these promises to yourself now, it kind of builds a foundation, almost like a refuge, so that when difficulties do come, you have a solid foundation to fall to. Because I know in the middle of suffering, someone coming up to you and saying, hey, you know what? Your suffering is going to produce perseverance and perseverance.
It's going to be okay. You know, God still loves you. It's like, I know you're really upset right now, but God loves you.
Let me tell you from experience, that's not helpful.
It's not helpful.
It does not.
Don't worry. Everything's going to be fine, you know?
While that's true.
Right. It doesn't help in the situation.
When you're the one in suffering, you're like, you need to be quiet.
Yes.
That is not helpful. But that's why I like being in God's word and reminding yourself of the promises of who you are, of who he is so vital and life-giving, because when the difficulty comes, and here's another difficult thing. This is one of the things I love. I mean, I love so many things about Jesus, but how brutally honest he is with us. In John 16, he says, in this world, you will have trouble. Yeah. You will have trouble, but take heart. And how are we to take heart? He goes, I have overcome the world, right? So cling to me all the time so that when trouble comes, suffering comes, you can have courage. You can take heart, have faith.
His promise for us.
Yeah. That I've overcome that. I've got you.
And Jesus knows suffering. I mean, he experienced it for us. So he's gone through all the hardships that we're going through. So even when you think no one else can understand what I'm going through, Jesus understands what I'm going through. He knows this suffering. He's experienced it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it's such a beautiful and good point. Like brings you back almost to the seeking community, like being known. When somebody goes through the same suffering, you feel heard and known. Well, that's Jesus. Yeah. He suffered in every way so that you could be seen and known. Like he truly is Emmanuel, like God with us. And so you just cling to what you know, and you know that he's with you, he's for you, he's good, he's faithful, and he will, one way or another, see you through it. And now, to close out our time together, let's say your loved one's going through suffering. What would you recommend?
There'd be a few things that I would recommend. Just three that come to the top of my mind, and that might change. But the first three that I can think of is one, if a loved one or a friend is suffering, is just sit with them. Sit with them in the suffering. Don't tell them, oh, but did you think about this that's going well? Or this is better, or you know, this is going to change. Don't try to talk them out of it. Let them sit in the suffering and sit with them. The second thing is encourage them to get help. Encourage them to speak to somebody who's either gone through it themselves. Join groups, support groups like the Cancer Companions. That's a really good one. And the third thing is that if your loved one is suffering, that you should also be in community with people, especially as a caregiver. If you're dealing with somebody who's physically suffering, caregivers, that's Jesus's hands and feet right there, caring for the least of these. And they especially need to have a lot of care as well.
Yeah, if you're a caregiver, sometimes you can be overlooked.
Yes.
And if that's you, you're not overlooked. You know, we love you, and man, what you're doing is such a gift. But you too would probably need some care and community and support. But yeah, your first point is like so on par. So often we just want to step in and fix it.
Fix it. Yeah.
But that's just kind of like who we are.
Job's, going back to your story, like
Yeah.
Job's friends, they were like, oh, well, this is what you must have done.
Yeah.
No, okay, well, then this is what God is doing to you. Like they just want to fix it.
You know, if
They
they
just
give them the answers to
quiet.
fix it, do this, and they're like,
so wrong.
they're way off. They're way off base.
Yeah.
And so, as hard as it is, you're right. You just sit with them in the suffering, and really, your mere presence
Yeah.
is
So helpful.
what brings light to people's suffering, because, and I think it's because we are bearers of Jesus's spirit. So when we sit with people in suffering, we are a living fulfillment of his promise of being with us to the very end of it. So like, let that sink in.
That's a beautiful
So like,
image.
when we suffer with people, we, like, Jesus uses us
Right.
to be the fulfillment of his promise for that person you're sitting with. And man, how beautiful and incredible that can be.
This is the priesthood of all believers, because
Right.
some people think, well, I don't have the pastoral skills or
Yeah.
the ministry skills to do this. This is the priesthood of all believers. We are all equipped and empowered to do that, to just sit with the suffering, be there with them. And when the time is right, point them back to the promise. You know, let them cry, let them yell, let them be angry, sad and frustrated, and then point them back to the promise.
Yeah.
Christ is for you. He's with you.
Yeah. Yeah. I really don't think there's much more to say. That's
Oh.
beautiful, incredible. And so thank you so much for joining us. And so if you are walking through a difficult season, man, please reach out. We'd love to connect with you, let you know you're not alone. If a loved one's going through suffering and you just want somebody to talk to, get advice or whatever it may be, again, reach out.
Yeah.
We just want to be here for you and be just a helpful resource on your journey. Well, Tanya, thank you for joining with me today, and you guys have a wonderful day.